explain our item for today at the
Sure
work
thing.
session?
Thank you, Mayor and council members for coming in this morning. So you may recall that we like to bring in allers on a frequent basis and talk about bond issuances, the legal aspects of those. We have public financial management that runs the numbers, but they always need to check in with allers to make sure that everything's kosher on the legal side. Allers is able to look at the tax exempt status and some of those things to make sure that as laws change at the federal level and the state level, that we continue to be compliant with all those issues. So with that, there's also annual reporting that is required. As we issue debt, those investors want to make sure we continue to do a good job with our finances. And as such, we file annual reports. And so those are continuing disclosure requirements. And with that, the market expects that there is some training that comes to the council on a frequent basis. And so again, we've asked Eric to come in and help us out with that. Thank you.
It sounds,
You got me?
you got it.
Perfect. Okay. Well, I'm happy to be here. Thank you for the introduction. The materials that I have for you this morning cover a broad brushstroke of the bond issuance process, recent legislative changes, the sale, disclosure aspects, and then some highlights on enforcement actions from the SEC. But really, I'm here, I'm a resource to you guys, and these sessions go better as a discussion, if at all possible. I'm happy to sit here and talk at you. But that being said, I want to start with, is there anything in particular topics-wise that you all want to hit early on? Or I will simply talk and go through the bases, and please interject at any moment. I appreciate the discussion if we get there. Let me make sure I figured. We're not shy.
Okay, does anyone have anything you want to start with, or do you want to just keep going?
Stuff or things that may have changed or things that we should be aware of?
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's early on in my process. I mean, I think one of the things that most relevant to you all, I'm sure you're well aware of House File 718 and the nuances and changes to bonding that occurred last year in 2023. They obviously changed dramatically your budgeting process that you're probably figuring out right now or going through right now. But the legislature also modified the election process for bonds, requiring that bond elections only occur now in November. There used to be quarterly options throughout the year, staggered by odd or even years, and now it's only November, which means that we have to plan dramatically for purposes of if we, A, expect an election, or B, in the context of a petition, if we were to receive a petition and someone asked to call that election, now all of a sudden, if it's early in the year, we might have to wait, if we're in December when we called that hearing, or January, we have to wait till November in order to find out whether or not we even have that authority itself. One of the benefits of 718 was that they increased the small issue amount for general corporate purpose bonds. For you have $1 million authority for general purpose bonds, and I have a slide on general projects, and we'll get to that here in a little bit. But just as the updates go, right now you currently have $1 million for those types of projects. In July, that will go to $1.3 million. There's a 30% increase, and that adjusts every January after that point in time. So the added authority is beneficial. The small issue allows us to bypass an election unless we get a petition, and so they utilized extensively for those types of projects. They also added a number of additional notice requirements, and they will change the way in which what we include in the published notice, what is included for purposes of tax levy implications, calculating and impacts of bonds. The Department of Management is still working through a little bit of how they want to see or how they interpret what the levy implications will be, and by that I mean they require in the notice as a result of this particular bond, what will the levy increase be? As you know, as someone who annually finances numerous projects, we have a multitude of hearings. And so you'll have a single essential corporate purpose hearing that covers a laundry list of streets, sewers, flood control, sidewalks, parks, et cetera. And then because of the GCP limits, we might have a number of GCP hearings. The question that we have from a procedural standpoint is, for the purposes of the notice relative to, well, what is the impact on the levy? Is it in the aggregate? Because you're going to combine all of those hearings into a singular bond issue. Or is it by each particular hearing itself? Well, what is the potential impact and levy impact of this particular subset of projects? That hasn't been answered. And in fact, the Department of Man, Ted Ellison, at a budget planning session from the league in the fall that I was at, commented that said, well, if you have debt falling off and then you're adding debt, your net impact, levy impact may very well be zero. I mean, because you have some going off, now you're adding in, and perhaps the notice implications there are zero, when in fact there is still, by adding debt, if you didn't add debt, then the levy would go down, the aggregate levy would go down. These bonds would include some sort of additional amount to pay the debt service. And so, as often is the case, the code isn't necessarily a model of clarity. And so we react accordingly, and we do our best. And so we're still navigating that. That doesn't kick in until July 1. We have all of the current budget, all of the closing out this fiscal year, to basically continue to pick their brains and frankly see what they do in this next session. There's a number of cleanups that I think have to or will likely occur in 718. They didn't catch everything. There were a number of issues in there. And so we will see, right? We all, correct, shocking is it's correct. But high level, that's what I would say relative to the bond impact. From a disclosure impact, and then we'll get to that again as well when I highlight some of the enforcement actions. But what I'm seeing, what we are seeing from the SEC is a wider net slightly relative to what they are pursuing and what they're expecting of people. And to that, I mean, they're now have incorporated and brought actions against auditors. I mean, issuers, officials, municipal advisors, underwriters, consultants have always been on the radar of the SEC because that's who's interacting and providing information. The SEC's goal and sole job is to make sure, A, to protect investors, and B, to make sure that the information that's being provided by issuers is accurate, timely, et cetera. And so all of the people that I just listed off are the ones interacting directly with the market and providing that information. The most recent is our auditors. Now, they're auditors who deficient in their role. I mean, didn't follow generally accepted accounting standards. They changed. It used to be GAAP. Now they're calling it GAS. And frankly, knew that some of the information was wrong, but provided the audit anyway. They weren't doing their job, but they knew or reasonably should have known that investors would rely upon that information, and providing that audit to an issuer who is going to market, knowing full well that that information was going to make it onto EMMA, the disclosure filing repository. The SEC has said, no, that's fraud, and we can't have that in this context. And so those are the highlights and the takeaways, frankly, for this particular year. And now I will touch a little bit on the process that we go through to get there. That makes sense. And again, I know no one's shy, so jump in as you see it. But as we get started with any project, any financing, there's three questions that I always ask. And that's really, what projects are you financing? Obviously, right? What are you pledging as security to the investors, which may be different than what you're actually paying the debt with? It's what are you pledging? And then who benefits from the project? The first two questions guide us down the path for Iowa Code for procedural aspects. How do we establish authority to actually bond? The third one relates to the tax exemption aspect in order to qualify for the better rates that we seek in issuing municipal debt. I've hit the age where my glasses, this is exactly where I can't between these two. So please bear with me as I try to navigate my eyes here. But, and my notes, isn't that great? So let's start with the state law aspects, and I want to kind of walk through the nuances of the first two questions. So you could very well have a stormwater project for which you are pledging taxes, and now we're in the geo side, and that process will simply be a public hearing. Simple 4 and 20, you call them all the time. That's the ECP that we talked about earlier. Contrast that if we're doing a stormwater project, same project, but pledging stormwater revenues. Now it's a 30-day hearing with the potential for a petition depending on the size and the amount of the project costs. The third route might be that you, behind the scenes, fully intend to utilize stormwater revenues to pay for the debt, but we're going to tell the market is that we're pledging to you the taxes. So we're going to issue this as a GO. We are subject only to the GO ECP hearing component. We're pledging taxes, but we intend to abate the tax with the stormwater. You guys do that all the time with TIF is an available source. Utility revenues are available source. Local option sales tax is an available source for abating. Sometimes we choose the GO route because A, GO is the cheapest rate you're going to get. B, you're already issuing GO and it's easier to combine and you're already going to market. You don't want to go with multiple issuances, or you want to minimize the number of issues you have out there perhaps. But the GO also counts against your constitutional debt limit, whereas the stormwater or a revenue obligation would not. And so there are balances that Nick and Joe in your finance department or communicate and discuss with PFM, Public Financial Management, who is your financial advisor, and they're balancing those. Where are we at in our constitutional debt limit? Where's the market at? Where are the rates, et cetera? But as we get, let's focus on the tax side. And I'll get into the benefit side a little bit here in a minute. But GO, again, that's the secured by the tax levy. The legislature's broken down these projects, the types of projects, new, essential, in general. Broad brushstroke. This is a list of what you would fully anticipate or expect to be essential corporate purposes. All governmental in nature, streets, bridges, sidewalks. I want to highlight the second bullet simply because of the utilities, it's only these three. I'm lumping stormwater and flood control together, but sewer water, stormwater, flood control, other utilities and enterprises are general and don't afford the benefits of the simple 4 and 20 hearing. But equipping police and fire, as opposed to, that's actual equipment, not the facilities themselves, existing airports, existing parks. And like I said, the process there is simply a public hearing.
How long are the duration of the GO bonds typically? Do they vary from 10 to 20 to 30 years, or is it all usually one?
That is 100% within your, well, first of all, never the latter, the 30.
Right.
Capped at 20. The actual amortization that you choose is a function of what you decide and discuss with what works in your budget, what works, how short do you want it? But 20 is the max. At times, if you have a project, because as you see, refunding, which is one of the items on there, which is basically just this for that. Sometimes refunding for savings, sometimes refunding for, we had a 30-year project, we could only do a 20-year maturity, we have a 20-year balloon, and we're going to refund that at some point in the life of that initial term to get us to the 30 that we need. Okay. Tax law would require us that we cannot have the bonds outstanding more than 120% of the useful life of the asset itself. The vast majority, when we look at that laundry list, but for equipping, would be, street sidewalks, they're going to be 40 plus years. You get into even, as we've seen, the fire and trucks and ambulances have a fairly extended life, pushing upwards of those 20 years. The patrol cars and computer obviously just turn quickly. Now, what do we do in that context? Because obviously you are financing equipment, you're doing computers and improving all of the facilities and whatnot. There's a blended average, so you can have 5-year assets coupled with 40-year assets, put them together. PFM calculates a number of those things to make sure that, A, what is the weighted average maturity of the bonds? A 20-year will actually only be about 12 years by the time you buy it down. And they'll allocate accordingly to say, well, we're going to make sure that we've retired an adequate amount for the shorter-lived assets on the front end.
Yeah, we've talked about that several years ago, that we're not going to obviously bond for
Yeah, so
like books and things like that. That not.
yeah, on the budgeting side, what finance puts together is categorizing each asset that's being borrowed against in a 5, 10, 15, or 20-year schedule, and then just layers those all together when the bond issues come up. So
So they are grouped like
they are grouped
things that are
5 years.
5 years or
Get paid back within 5 years.
Okay. Okay.
Yep.
Right. That's it. That's the important, exactly.
Yeah,
On the
that's-
front end. So when they
I know
will,
we've had that discussion in
100%.
years past.
and you're not alone. Excuse me.
Okay. I thought that was our policy.
All of your peers will have that. So you'll see, as much as we try to have a perhaps level debt service, or there will be blips throughout, and or you say we've moved those assets to the front end, in the allocation.
Does, and maybe both Scott, you and Eric can answer, but let's say we go out for a longer term bond and I think the word you used was layer, feather in 5-year. If in the first 5 years we paid off cars and books, does that mean that we're not paying off
No.
bridges until year 6?
No, it's level debt service for each category. So it truly is paying higher principal back in the first years, the first 5 or 10 years, because you're getting the full amount of the 5-year assets paid off, and a portion of the 15 and 20 years are still being paid off as well in those first 5 or 10 years. So,
Yeah, I assume that we're just like confirm this, I guess. I assume that we are doing that because instead of like going out for just a separate bond for 5 years for cars, by rolling it all together and layering it, we get.
yeah, there's what's called a cost of issuance that Eric mentioned, that you if you can, you want to issue one set of debt once a year, preferably, and then that way you save on what's the cost of issuance. So PFM's fees, the market fees, legal fees that are associated with issuance. Think of like closing costs for a house. So you just want to do that all once if you can, a year.
Every individual bond will have its own costs, correct? And so the more that you can combine, the more efficient you can be relative to taking advantage of. We'll get into the details of when we go to market, but what does that entail, and the offering document and the continuing disclosure requirements and the like. If you had to break that up from an administration standpoint for every particular new purpose, then it would become overly burdensome from an administration standpoint. But so that's the ECP side. The GCP side, again, are now what the legislature's categorized, not necessarily essential, but still important from a governmental standpoint, but changes the process relative to creating the authority. And those are, like I said, the other utilities, recreation grounds, swimming pools, new parks, other city facilities in general, et cetera. You have the list. Full-on election, 60% approval, and as we mentioned, the November now only requirement, with the side asterisks of the small issue, which we also touched on. So we currently have $1 million, and that goes to $1.3 million in July. The one-off in financing, it's technically characterized as an essential corporate purpose, but has the process of a general corporate purpose small issue, and that's urban renewal. And so another power and authority that you utilize regularly, and that once a project exists in an urban renewal area, in the plan for an urban renewal area, we can then finance that subject to a petition, but without regard to the sizing limitation of the GCP. And so it's a 10-day notice, right to petition, but unlimited in amount, only limited by what is listed in the actual urban renewal plan itself, which is a extensive diligence that we end up going through with economic development to ensure that the plans are accurate and enumerate exactly what we plan to do and what we need to do, and that it supports what the potential financing might be. So.
It's 60% approval, is that?
That's not new. That's always been, yeah. Bond elections.
Okay.
The majority only are sales tax. There is it's a facility. It's like a county city joint action facility. You can enter into a 28E, and that you have this. They're often used for jail facilities, county routes through the city, and that's subject to an election. Rarely used, but it's that election is 50% majority only. You can then levy taxes, and what happens is it's actually a lease revenue stream, but the lessor, I always get these wrong, lessor, lessee. Tom, help me out. Which one is the one actually paying? Lessor? No, who's paying the under a lease when you're the renter? Lessee. Okay. The lessee can levy the tax, and that's what you're pledging relative to the pay the debt service under that structure. We've done a couple of those recently, and I think primarily designed to take advantage of the majority rule as opposed to 6% is just a burden. Or it's just a harder threshold, obviously. We touched on the House File 718 and the nuances associated with the changes there, and that's really the highlight.
How often does that amount go up from the 1.3?
Every January now.
That's what I thought you'd said, so.
Correct, yeah. So the interesting part is,
50%?
so we're going to go from in July 1, we've got 1.3, awesome, 6 months. Then
It goes up again?
it will go up again, but not 30%.
Oh,
It will be effectively a cost of living, or it's tied to an index of some sort. They have not pinned down the actual process. It says sometime in January they'll let us know what that might be. And so it's kind of which is at the point where everyone is doing your pre-levies, trying to budget, trying to determine what are we going to be doing in the coming fiscal year. And so that part is one of the items that I hope gets ironed out
quickly?
this session. Yeah. As of right now, we're going to have 1.3 in July.
Okay.
I'm confident of that. But, and I know that's to be true, but after that, I'm not exactly sure what.
Okay.
I don't think that, though tied to an index, I don't think it will ever ratchet down. I think it's only an inch up. So it could stay level. But the adjustment may be zero, depending on and so then you stay at whatever the new level is.
So this is the first time in how long have they raised this?
40-some years.
Oh, unbelievable. Yeah, yes.
Oh, okay.
Very.
So it was,
It was $1 million in the 80s.
oh, okay.
Correct. Now, the only other comparable, they have done this where there's an adjustment, and it's in the competitive bidding
Okay.
statute. Chapter 26 has what are the thresholds relative to, it started at if the project is $100,000, then you have to publicly bid. There were nuances and exceptions to that, and that was a good 10 plus years ago. So it has adjusted. Now it's $127,000 or something like that. I don't know what so it does inch. And there is a model so they may look at it and say, well, that was a success. We don't have to tweak it at all. But with bonding, I mean, given that we're talking about authority and a process that we don't feel like we're not comfortable in having our issuers call the 1.3 until that law is effective July 1,
Right.
even though we have issuers right now planning for their budgets, calling hearings now for bonds that will be sold in the summer. And so we're in that little bit of a gray area relative to, well, we don't want any extra bases for someone to come in and say, well, we want to make your life difficult, and we think that you called that hearing before the authority existed, and now we don't think that authority exists. We can call the $1 million now, and we can call 300 later,
Okay.
and alike. And so that's the geo side. The revenue side, we touched a little bit on stormwater, but there obviously are sewer and water, although Des Moines Water Works would handle that on your end. Other enterprises, if there could be some sort of recreational or conventional or parking, absolutely. And so that process is a little bit different. And the authority to issue by those enterprise or utilities is narrowed. It has to be in furtherance of the entity or the utility itself, by way of example, we can't have parking, for example, issuing to build a new park or to do a number of other things. It has to be to benefit that particular system. Unlike a GO issue where bondholders can go in, they are the GO secured by the tax, and if there were an issue, they can go into the court and say, I'm not being paid, please have them court tell the issuer to levy that tax, so I will be paid. Revenue doesn't have that structure. They can't go in and say, hey, go find more customers. What they can do is say, well, you're not generating enough revenue, so you have to make sure and increase your rates. If your customer base is fixed and you're charging them X, you need to charge them X plus in order to generate sufficient revenues. And the statute says that the rates have to be sufficient to cover your operation and maintenance, plus debt service, plus any reserves that may be required. And reserves are one of the covenants that we may find. The revenue deals will include additional protections for the investors to the tune of rate covenants, minimum amount, reserve funds, which may be an added borrowing amount to set aside in the event of a shortfall in revenue stream. We can tap into that reserve fund to make sure that there isn't a default and then have to replenish it, or additional bonds tests to mean that since these bondholders, have a direct claim or the first claim to the revenue stream, before you add any additional debt, there has to be demonstration that the revenue stream is more than adequate, and it's usually 110 minimum up to 135, depending on the variability of the operations of that particular enterprise. But again, it's a protection for the existing bondholders as well as the new. These typically carry a higher interest rate because of the added risk, and therefore the default or focus on general obligation bonds if in the context of choosing. Obviously, the one benefit touched on earlier, revenue bonds do not count against your constitutional debt limit. As you're all aware, that is a 5% of your outstanding value. In the 2022 valuation for the current fiscal year, it was $16 billion, giving you $800 million of constitutional debt limit. In the 23 value actually bumped up to $19 million, and effective July 1 of this year, bumping you then up to 950-ish, and adding additional constitutional authority for you there. Questions on the city bond process authority? Nope, good. The third question we talked about was who benefits and why does that matter? The IRS is jealously guards, from my perspective, those are my words, I don't know how they would like that, but jealously guards the subsidy that they view the tax exemption to be. Why is it a subsidy? Well, holders in a tax-exempt issue do not have to include the interest income in their general income for gross income for federal income taxes, meaning IRS isn't getting any money from that. So they want it to be narrowly tailored for governmental purposes. There are minor exceptions for certain types of categories of bonds for private activity and the like, but in the normal governmental context where the space where you're often playing, private activity will create a tax problem for us or potentially impact the tax-exempt status. Private activity simply means benefiting a private business. The IRS does not want us to, for example, spend tax-exempt dollars on I'll just take a library as an example, for which a significant portion of which includes a rented out space for a Starbucks, for example, and Starbucks then benefiting from and profiting from the subsidized space built on behalf of within that library itself. The spread between tax exempt and taxable, this is a rough estimate, but about 1.5 points right now. That's varied. It was several years ago when in the highlight of the pandemic, that was much narrower, almost down to 25 basis points. And as markets have moved and inflation, it's brought back up. That's a more traditional spread there at the current one. Once we know what we're bonding for, what we're pledging, where we're going, and all those projects put together, then we can decide, all right, hey, how are we going to sell this? How are we going to get money to fund these projects? Traditionally, you've sold competitively that taking bids, leveraging competition, and basically taking advantage of your high rating. As you see here, this is from your 23, the snapshot of the 23A GEO issue. This is a snap from S&P rating service, AA plus, reimposed for 23A, and then affirmed for outstanding. The S&P rating categories are AAA, AA, single A, then they get into the Bs. Obviously, the plus is an enhancement, and so you're literally one step below the highest, a testament to fiscal discipline, and you're rewarded with the lowest rates possible relative to that. And so,
And what holds us back from the AAA?
That's a great question.
So, yeah, there are probably 16 as we record how they measure the credit rating, 16 different factors. And the ones that are negative for us or are not to the level of a AAA include demographic, ability to pay from our residents. So they look at the average income of your community, and so that is lower. The total amount of debt is not at the AAA rating. That would be probably at a single A rating at this point. So the sheer amount of debt, which we're at about 80% of our state capacity and authority, that one hinders us a little bit. But then most of the rest of the factors are in pretty good shape. Reserve funds used to be the other factor that we were not good at. But about 10 years ago, we started adding to our fund balance and are at a point now where that probably could fall in the AAA rating. So really, we're down to a couple of things that aren't going to change. The demographics and the total amount of debt would have to be significantly lower each year, thus lowering the CIP plan. So I think we need...
Even if the reserve would grow,
Yeah.
There's no way around obviously there's no way around the demographic, but the debt.
Yeah, we'd have to have enormous fund balance just sitting in our accounts, which becomes silly at some point why are you still borrowing at all if you've got...
It's that significant.
Yeah. Yep. And understand the reserves, once you've spent them, they're gone. So those are one-time corrections if there's a bad economy, something that's harmful. Whereas your demographics and the ability to pay of your community doesn't change much easily. And so if you have a wealthy community, you're always going to have the higher credit ratings. And it's really, really hard to overcome a low income level of your community. We're very fortunate, frankly, to have the AA plus, given our
It's an
demographics.
incredible rating.
What is all the nonprofit that we can't
Yeah.
tax?
So
Because we have a high proportion of non-ability.
That is one of the-
profit
that is one of the factors,
that
both
we'll
on
never
the
overcome.
both on the good and the bad.
Right.
And so on the bad side, having so many governmental units, hosting so many governmental entities and nonprofits in Des Moines harms us in some of the factors of taxability, ability to garner revenues out of them because they don't pay property taxes. So that harms us. But then it also helps us because they see that as a diversity of your economy and that there is the vitality of sales going on, retail and activity in your community. So it actually factors in both directions.
Okay.
And AA plus spur, could you explain that?
Spur. It's so small. It's stable. Is that you're right behind? Is the last one?
Spurs /
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. That I don't. Other than special purpose urban renewal. Yeah. That's all that. And then those are let's see, unenhanced rating. It says AMBAC on there.
I don't think we have any of those.
Those are the TIF.
Yeah.
Correct? No.
No, that was a special purpose, which I think have actually retired, so I'm kind of surprised that that's still on there.
Yeah,
I don't
I'm not
think we
sure.
actually have any debt in that category at the moment. I'll confirm that, but that's not our typical TIF, that it falls up in the GO.
Yeah,
We're
I'm
putting those
not
together.
sure with that one.
At the AMBAC, so that must have been a series we issued many years ago that had an insurance policy
That
on
had insurance, yeah,
the AMBAC,
yeah,
which is not even an industry
correct,
anymore.
right.
So
So that's gone.
It became
That's not
two.
on here?
I'll confirm that we don't even have that.
That one's paid, or
Yeah.
Never mind.
I think so.
in Des Moines? 6 or 7 or?
Actually, more than that now. I think we're up to 9.
Are we up to 9?
They don't all have debt against them, though.
No.
They may just have a project
Yeah.
or two.
We're waiting for a project.
So once we've decided we're going to sell, then we start to dabble in, well, which pool are we jumping into? When we seek to access investors as opposed to a singular lender, and the investors then route through an underwriter in your normal competitive sale. You have an underwriter who's bidding, purchasing. They have no intent of holding those bonds themselves. They then spin them off to investors, which could be full-on institutional investors, insurance companies, funds, just investment funds, all the way down to ma and pa. Anyone who seeks, they're broken into $5,000 increments, and so your debt will be held by potentially thousands of investors. As opposed to, again, the full-on lender like we did recently with JP Morgan relative to the building acquisition. That was one, JP Morgan is holding that directly, and that's an entirely different process. We were negotiating daily and nightly with their counsel, and worked out just fine, but it's just an entirely different process. Because they then sought to, well, what protections does that lender individually need? And we found some new covenants that they proposed. In the investor-driven route, which we've traditionally been through the underwriters, then it's the SEC, Security Exchange Commission, federal agency charged with protecting those investors. And they do that through requiring, transparency and timely information. As much as the SEC wants to view the muni market as the equity market, they want us to be like a public company, but we're not a public company. We are public, but we don't have anywhere near the same regulations. They have quarterly filings with all very specific information that investors can access in real time and decide on a day-to-day basis, I either do or do not want to continue this investment. We don't have quarterly meetings or quarterly reports like that. And the information that we do provide is on an entirely different schedule. And so we'll get into that a little bit, but municipal debt is governed by the Securities Act of 1933 and the Security Exchange Act 1934. It's basically anti-fraud. That's our standard. We have to provide full disclosure of all material information, and the technical test is that all of the information that we provide cannot contain any misstatement of material fact or omit a material information necessary to make the information relevant. Material is what would a reasonable investor deem important in making their decision. That's about the only definition we've ever gotten from the SEC, and that becomes important as we get into their enforcement actions because the SEC doesn't want to be overly transparent. They want us to be transparent, but they're not overly transparent in their regulation or their guidance. Why? Because if they give us black and white, then some people out there, as we'll see in the enforcement, who push the envelope will simply do the bare minimum. If they leave it a little blurry, then they have flexibility to come in and say, well, no, this is what we actually meant. And as we looked at what you've done, we're interpreting it and said either you held to the standard or you didn't hold to the standard. The market has begged the SEC to tell us what's material. Not just a definition like that. What would a reasonable investor deem significant? Well, no, tell us. Is it financials? Is it X, Y, and Z? And they won't. And so we're left to interpret a little bit, and we'll get into that in a bit. But technically, the SEC's regulation of you is not direct, but through the underwriter itself. The underwriter cannot bid on a offering of municipal securities unless there's a primary disclosure and offering document. The official statement should be a term you're familiar with, 90-plus page document outlining a whole bunch of details relative to you. And once they bid, they cannot buy unless there's a contract from the issuer to provide annual updates, and that's a continuous disclosure certificate. Scott made mention of that. What are the ongoing requirements that we have to provide? Your audit, which you get every year, must be provided 270 days after the close of your fiscal year. I highlight 270 days simply because this is why we're not a public company or a corporation that's issuing stock that have quarterly reports. Ours are 3 months after the close of the fiscal year. So at the very beginning of July 1, they're not going to get, investors aren't going to get a potential update from us for 4 quarters plus 3 quarters. Emma, which we'll get into, is a place where they can go find information, and there are more frequent required notices, which we'll get into as well. But again, touched on the official statement. This is that big, broad brushstroke document, the front end of which, it tells the story, it tells the city's story. The front end says, what projects are you issuing for? What's the authority for issuing them? What are you pledging to pay? And what's the tax status? Those 3 questions sound familiar? They were the ones that we started with: projects, pledge, and tax exemption. That's the relevant information that they want relative to what they are purchasing. The backside of the OS are appendices that have a lot of statistical data. In a geo structure, a lot of information on taxes, valuations, collection rates, median incomes, outstanding debt relative to the debt limit. In a revenue scenario, you're going to have what are the number of customers, what are the rates, where are the revenue streams and coverage ratios related to outstanding costs versus debt, collections, et cetera, et cetera. Growth opportunities. And both structures will highlight, well, what are the potential exposures associated to this investor? From a general obligation standpoint, if you were pushing up against your debt limit, perhaps. Otherwise, they can, like I said, go to court and ask the court, tell this issuer to levy the taxes if we are not being paid. From a revenue provision or producing entity, maybe there are environmental concerns. Maybe we're subject to flooding that could completely shut down the plant that is operating that generates those revenues. You shut down the plant, there are no revenues. We don't have that risk from a geo perspective, but all of that is laid out in this particular document. That's on the front end, and this is inviting the investors to bid. Frankly, it's the underwriters that bid, but they use this document to then sell to their ma and pa investors or the institutionals themselves. That's primary disclosure. The secondary disclosure is a continuing disclosure certificate with the annual filings and a contract to continue to provide information relevant to those investors as deemed and as included in the official statement. And so at a bare minimum, you have to provide the audit. There are also financial and operating data that in the tables in the appendix that are also updated within that same time period, 270 days from the close of your fiscal year. And there's a whole category on Emma, which we'll show that are filed. The more timely are these 16 events. I combined several of them, so there aren't 16 bullets there, but which all relate to basically payment issues, any reserve issues, calls if you're paying them off or you've defeased the debt, if there was a rating change, a trustee change. The 2 most recent additions were in 2019 and relate to the last 2 there, and new financial obligations relevant to the bondholders. And so had you entered into a new loan or some other new a guarantee, under that scenario, we've characterized the development agreements where you've contractually obligated to provide incentives under the development agreement to the developer, often conditioned, both on performance and also on annual appropriation. And so the aggregate amount may not actually count against, but there is a continued payment beyond the current fiscal year or potential payment. And so those have been filed on Emma. I made mention to Emma, but this is since 2008, it was actually rolled out as a pilot project in mid-2008. By mid-2009, July 1, 2009, it became the official repository of all information bond specific. Within that, every issue that you have outstanding that has been publicly sold or at least subject to an OS is included. This is a snapshot of the far right tab. You can see the blue up there. It says event-based disclosures. That would be that list that we just highlighted, the 16 events. So you'll see, I'm sorry, small text there, but development agreements, the entry into the loan with JP Morgan, I believe is on there, if I can read it. But if there were bond calls, anything in there that you'd paid off debt early, that would be listed in the event-based. Go one tab over, financial disclosures. I don't have a snap of that, but all of your audits, all of the FinOp, as I call it, financial operating data tables, all timely filed. There is a table, you can see all the contact information. You can go over some and what official statements are out there. Trade activity of the actual bonds in the secondary market. As much as we aren't daily trades like stocks are, there are movements within your debt. Certain holders will sell, and that the valuations of those bonds fluctuate throughout, but that's on their end, not ours. You're paid on the front end. So far, what we've really talked about are just the procedural steps that you go through to establish authority to sell the debt, and what have you committed to provide continued information to the markets to keep your investors happy and knowledgeable whether they want to continue. We mentioned the SEC's job is to protect those investors, but they have not, are not overly, like I said, transparent or have not been helpful by way of guidance in what we need. All we have are trends and interpretations of the enforcement actions that they have. And if we look at these from the context of what type of provisions are we subject to? Anti-fraud. So you will see this theme, and I've highlighted, and this is the same that we touched on. These base enforcement actions haven't changed. These are what initially guided. So here we have the state of Illinois hid that their pension fund was going to fail in their offering document, asking for someone to invest it, buy their bonds, but didn't say that we're on the crux of financial problems. That was problematic. The city of Harrisburg hid that they guaranteed $455 million of debt. It was a component unit underneath there, so a sub, like a utility or a school district, depending on how they are structured. We don't have, schools won't fall under your umbrella, but obviously $455 million crippled the city, and they didn't let anybody know about that. They kind of swept that under the rug. SEC doesn't like that. Miami didn't disclose that they had no intention, or they bonded for on a tax-exempt basis, bonded for a taxable project. The leases associated with that caused them to violate provisions and could have easily let people know that. West Clark School District was basically actually full-on lie. They affirmatively stated that they'd never failed to comply with their continuing disclosure contracts, and yet they'd actually never filed a thing. That was the start of the MCDC project, where voluntary disclosures were highlighted. But as you can see, the water district manipulated data as to their coverage ratios. So coverage, again, in a revenue scenario, how much revenue are we generating? We can't force them to levy a tax or generate revenues. They made it look like they had much more than they did, and that was problematic. Oyster Bay, The mayor had side deals with local developers to provide coverage and guarantee their projects, and that was problematic. I highlight the other examples here, just again, hidden financials, misleading projections. In the SEC publishes all of their enforcement actions on a continual basis. These are those which have occurred since we last spoke in 21, or that which I can fit on a one screenshot. But again, you see the same type of fraud, breach of care, falsifying documents, intentionally misleading investors. And quite honestly, you know, I've done this for, it's 24 years. Whether it's Iowa Nice or what have you, I've never seen this level of action within our state. There are some, like I said earlier, where the SEC doesn't want to draw a line in the sand because there are actors that will do the bare minimum. We don't operate this way. This type of action, these types of, I'm not going to falsify things. But it's what they're looking for. The trend that I see, and I touched on earlier, is that they're casting a wider net relative to the actors. Auditors were, like I said, in 23, the most recent final actions or settlements that they had where auditors weren't living up to their duties relative to the issuers. In that particular case, there were some, the issuer officials were also somewhat complicit in that, knowing that some of the information was false, and so they got picked up. I draw that attention simply to say, well, we often will rely upon our auditors. We think that they are doing what they're supposed to do. And so if they acted alone and just didn't do their job, well, then I don't think that there would be issuer concerns, liability, et cetera. But in the federal fiscal year runs October to October, and just recently came out relative to the 23 fiscal year. 8%, SEC reported an 8% year-to-year increase of their enforcement actions. Of that, the public finance abuse unit only comprises 1% of all enforcement actions of the SEC. So we're a sliver, but they're increasing their focus and increasing their actions of what they're looking for. You have a policy. Last updated, I went back and looked. Now, can I find, in May? Yeah, May of 2019, I'd mentioned the change and addition of the two new events, the financial obligations for continuing disclosure. Updated, that triggered in February. You guys updated in May. All good. This policy outlines Nick as the finance director, oversees, and as your disclosure coordinator, works with public financial management, works with the city attorney's office, works with us to compile information relative to that offering document to ensure that the information in there meets the standards of no misstatement of material fact or omitting those necessary. You all can rely upon that diligence process that they go through. Your involvement would be if there are things that they aren't privy to. You all may be contacted in your official capacity by a developer or a industry looking to leave. Look, we've got to move, but can you help us? Is there something you can do for us? Or we want to come to you, but are you able to incent us in some fashion? The departure is probably the bigger issue. If a major now you don't have a high concentration of like one industry isn't going to make or break Des Moines. There are communities that might. So I may be highlighting a moot point here, but my point in talking about it is that you all may be approached with information that Nick would never have or the city's attorney's office would never have. If the worst case scenario would be that we go to market, we offer up this offering document, invite investors to come in, sell those bonds, close on those bonds, and then a month later, boom, the bomb drops, the mic drops, and there's this catastrophic information that had we known about it, the market will say, well, wait a minute, that's material to me. A reasonable investor would have been swayed by that particular information. Maybe I wouldn't have bought your bonds. And now we're fighting over whether or not, who knew what, when, and where, how, et cetera. The other highlight that I want is in that particular policy, there is an express statement regarding public statements, or not express provision, but a process regarding public statements. In this digital world with social media and the focus on you all, there's a mic I suspect, in your face at times that you hadn't anticipated, or you're there to speak. They want to know what your input is. If it were on a particular project, and these, again, you often issue geo, tax-based, we're okay. The issue would be is if we had a convention project that if it weren't built, couldn't generate revenue, couldn't pay off the bonds. Where people have gotten in trouble is that this is the best thing that will ever happen in this community. We have to have it, and it will revolutionize what we're doing. And yet we didn't have, like, if you don't issue the bonds and maybe the grant money and whatnot, it's not a foregone conclusion that the project's going to be up and running, or your pro forma has certain assumptions that, yes, it will hit it out of the park, but if you don't hit those assumptions, it could fail dramatically. And you're privy to all of that information, and yet you're out in the public making these express statements. Hey, you've got to get on board with this. The trend, recall when I said the auditor, how did they get the auditor? That auditor knew, or reasonably should have known, that that information was going to make it to investors. If you're making statements regarding, out in the public regarding whatever project that may be, you are the face of the community, and your statements, you should know or reasonably know, will reach investors. And so this simply says, be careful in the information that you provide, confirm that it's accurate. I would build that up a little bit. Just don't puff it up a little bit, just toe the line. That's what I've got for you. We covered a lot. You had good questions, but are there other questions?
Any questions?
Might be a question for you. You mentioned that we're at 80% of our state cap. Are there categories of our debt that are not subject to the state cap?
Yes, we do have revenue debt that's
Is that like
associated with
water,
enterprises. Yes, parking.
If you were to add that in, where would we be compared to our state limit? Over 100?
I'd have to do the math. That's not required of any, that we could sure do the math, but that's not required anywhere or measured or shared typically.
Is there anything we should know about the distinction between those, or anything that requires different disclosures?
So what I would draw your attention to is that the revenue side has those additional covenants for rate coverages, additional bonds test. Those are all designed to provide protections because the investors don't have those same type of remedies available to them on the tax side. It doesn't count as constitutional debt, but it's exclusive to each of those enterprises or the utilities, whatever it might be. So each fund has its own limitations on how are we. It's almost like self-managed, right? The investors have said, we look at what you offer, your revenue stream secure, you're growing, et cetera, what have you. We support in purchasing the debt, we support that operation, provided you follow jump through the following hoops and hurdles. Those hoops and hurdles are what protect and insulate you from not overextending yourself, right? I mean, because overextending means you're going to default, and those investors don't want you to default, and so, and you're not going to default because of those protections. Now, if what you're talking about from a policy perspective is, well, how much debt should we have? Well, the constitutional debt limit is simply a state-imposed limitation, and you're well within those parameters, and you can't go obviously above that legally. The enterprise debt it's kind of self-regulating. I mean, I'm not sure I'm tracking on the, it depends on what you're talking about. Like, should we be aware of, what are we disclosing? You're disclosing all of the debt that you have outstanding from each fund. And particularly if you're going to go issue, more parking debt or the like. But the impact of that on your GO, for example, is negligible, only in so much as a default over here, or even narrowing of the pushing up against those covenant compliance thresholds, where are we at on the rate coverages and the like, only impacts those bondholders, not the GO. And so they're not going to be swayed by what's happening over here. And equally, the revenue doesn't really care what's going on the GO, because they don't have any claim against your tax revenue or your tax ability to tax. They're going to look exclusively on what's going on with this particular bubble, this fund, this operation.
And that's why the credit ratings are separate. I mean, they do a separate analysis for each utility that we borrow against.
Does that other debt impact our bond rating at all?
On the GO side, no. It's not one of the 16 factors. And there are some communities, frankly, that have better enterprise credit ratings than they do their tax, their GO tax. They may have a very weak tax base, but a very strong utility. So you can see different mixes of credit ratings.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to see. Yes.
Just a quick question on House File 718. What was the general thinking to change the state law so that bond elections are only November?
I think, I can only speculate, but I think that county auditors and those that administer may very well have said, these are cumbersome, and there were staggered dates throughout. So they could be having a school election in the second week of April and a city election the third week in April, and those weren't, I think it was always first and second or whatever it might be. But to populate that and administer it is burdensome, and say, why don't we just let bond elections be in one? That may have been, I have, no sense of that. I do think that it was the turnout in November election much higher.
Sure.
And I think that the legislature, the Hill, is opposed to debt. They don't want to give you guys the flexibility to operate and do what you need to do to operate. They said new debt is new tax. These are GO. So new debt, new taxes, new costs. And therefore, we need to have we want to make it a little harder to get. And B, we want to make sure we have the most turnout. And so the 60% approval is already a high threshold. The constraints in if an election doesn't pass, there were limitations in the code prior. You couldn't go back. You had to wait 6 months anyway to proceed. Now we're going to have to wait a full year. Again, from a timing perspective, let's say that you have a project that you know is going to election, or it's subject to the petition, and you get a petition in January, you're not going to know until November whether or not you can actually do that project. And if it fails, you're a year later. What does that do? It thwarts you. In all likelihood, they would say, well, they'll find a different way to finance. They're not going to pay for it with debt. They'll have to figure something else out. Or they just won't do it. Well, what if it's that important to your community? I don't know. I don't know. But to us, overall, 718 was focused on capping growth and taxes with the 3% and the general fund limitations and the budgetary and the like. Eric interprets the bond provisions as a constrainment on the authority, and adding extra hoops makes it less likely there'll be more debt.
Any other questions? If not, thank you
Thank you.
for this lesson on a very exciting subject. For Scott, it is, right? But we will end this work session and then reconvene. our regular meeting. Will start at 4:50, I believe, is the agenda. So we will see everyone back this afternoon. Thank you.